Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 152. Hey, today we're talking about Firefox, what's new and what's coming in 2018. We are your hosts today, Justin Barrow, Danny Blue, and Leon Rebel.
Hi.
Danny, Leon, so good to see you today.
How's it going, Justin?
You know, it's a frigid cold air here, but I find when it's cold that my fingers type faster and the code flows. Like I like to think that code can burn calories as I'm typing. That's really what I'm going for any day of the week. At this point, I'm just rambling. So instead of rambling, though, let's before we introduce our guest this week, let's throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, early bird tickets for Nordic.js, which is a conference in Stockholm on the 6th of September, are available to purchase now. Polymer 2.4 has been released, which paves the way for the 3.0 release, so you can read all about that in their blog post. GitHub has just released an interesting new feature, which basically allows you to add co-authors to individual commits, so you can share credit for bug fixes or new features or anything, which is kind of cool. Blink has just published an intent to implement a new API called Picture-in-Picture, which allows websites to create a floating video window, always like on top of other windows, so that users can continue consuming media while they interact with other content sites or applications on their device. Very much, I think, like the Android like window feature. There's a new TC39 proposal, which has just been published, and it includes the ability to easily get the last item in an array instead of having to do like the index -1 trick. And Webpack 4 beta has just been made available, which includes better performance and better defaults, which you can read more about in their blog post. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web.
Thank you, Leon. Some good stuff there. You know, I'm glad that I will not see -1 anymore if the TC39 proposal comes through. I don't know which stage it's at, but I'm hoping. And actually, before we introduce our guest this week, I'm going to actually throw it over to Danny, who's going to talk about a giveaway. We're giving away something, Danny. What are we giving away?
We are brand new. We actually have a couple of boxes of Daydreams that we've been, trying to decide what we're going to do with, and we decided we would like to give them to you, the our podcast listening audience. So what we're going to do is we are going to give you all a chance to win a Daydream. It's really easy to enter. All you need to do is go to the webplatformpodcast.com, go to subscribe, and get on to our mailing list. After that, after a certain period of time, we haven't decided exactly how long, we'll take a look, see how many responses we get, and then we'll pick some folks and ship you all a Daydream. So that's really it. We'll probably have some other ways of giving them out other than just that. But for right now, if you want a Daydream, webplatformpodcast.com/subscribe.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, we're hoping to give away some interesting, cool things this year as we sort of, decide to help you as developers out there have something tangible other than your code. Do you still print your code? Probably not. Speaking of tangible things, let's talk about Firefox. Let's introduce our guest this week, Mr. Matthew Claypotch. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Nice to be here.
So for people who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a web developer advocate at Mozilla. I've been at Mozilla for, it'll be 8 years in April, which is 100 million years in coder years. Kind of got into front-end web development right when that seemed like something people were hiring for. Got very lucky in that regard, and have spent a lot of time in the world of JavaScript and CSS, and now I get to talk about it for my job. So I'm pretty happy where I am.
And as you've sort of been developing for the web, you're sort of in the sort of standards wonderful world of things. Mozilla sort of paved the way for a web that we sort of know now, whether people realize that or not. And Firefox has been up to a lot lately, it seems, as Firefox Quantum has landed and whatnot. For listeners out there who have probably seen Firefox Quantum in the news and whatnot, what exactly is Firefox Quantum for those listeners out there?
Absolutely. So as you say, we've been in the web standards game, sort of as long as anyone else has been. Mozilla was created actually from, just fun fact Tuesday. Mozilla was actually created from the sort of remnants of Netscape, where they open sourced the code for the Netscape browser, and an organization was formed to protect that, and that was Mozilla. And relatively early on, Mozilla decided to revamp that code base into a standards compliant rendering engine called Gecko. And Gecko has actually sort of, Gecko started kind of underneath the hood of the Mozilla browser and then became really truly the underpinning of Firefox starting in 1.0. And Gecko has carried us all the way to the year 2016, 2017. And really, it's a venerable piece of code, but we're starting to show its age, especially as newer, sort of more modernly architected incumbents entered the space, such as obviously Blink, which is based on WebKit, and even Edge, even Microsoft with Edge, sort of said, hey, we're going to revamp our engine. And so it was like, we're getting a little long on the tooth. What should we do here? And we had this research project called Servo, which is written in the wonderful language called Rust, which I don't think we'll have time to get too far into today. And it's really this, like, from the ground up, what does it mean to build a modern web engine? How do you take advantage of the vast parallelism and concurrency features possible with modern technology and a safe programming language? And how do you redefine what a web browser can do and how fast it can be given that? And so we saw this experimental project called Servo and say, hey, can we sort of unbolt parts of Servo as it's ready and bolt them onto Gecko to replace things? And after much internal wrangling, the answer was, yeah, I think so. And that's really what Quantum is. It is a revamping of the core of Firefox using pieces of this futuristic research tool bench called Servo, which it still is an independent project and you can totally go play with. But we're taking pieces of Servo when they're ready. We're taking what we've learned with Gecko and we're fusing those things together and making a truly modern web rendering or web engine that can hopefully get us set for the next generation of browsers, which is going to be pretty fun. And this is really step one, is Firefox Quantum.
Were you surprised by the response Firefox Quantum sort of got? I mean, the overall response I felt was this blossoming of joy and happiness.
I would say that we were very pleased. I would say surprised doesn't imply that we were, not a little hopeful there, but we definitely were a little hopeful that this would be received. And we've always kind of had this thing where people, even our competitors at the end of the day lean over and go, hey, we really love what you guys are doing over there. And, we really support, the mission and everything. So everyone's always quietly been rooting for Mozilla, even when, we're not in the forefront. And now that we sort of have said, hey, we're back at it, we got this brand new thing and we are trying to start kicking some butt again. Everyone's like, all right. And that's all that quiet, latent enthusiasm is sort of now bubbling to the surface, which is really pleasant to see. I'm not going to lie. I always say my job's easier when what we've got to ship is incredible. So I wouldn't say we were surprised, but we're very pleased that people are excited for us.
Yeah, no, it's surprising that the community can be really excited. It's not surprising, but when there is just something genuinely good, everybody's like, oh, that thing is cool. Like, there's not a lot to really argue about at that point. So everybody's like, oh, okay. And then you just move on.
Yeah. And it's, I think, obviously no release is flawless and we had to make a lot of tough decisions in the sort of finalizing of this new stable base that Firefox Quantum is. But I think the overall release has been, the overall worldwide perception has been almost a sigh of relief. Like, oh, we worried about you for a minute there. We're so glad to have you back and like swinging. And that's really gratifying.
Would it actually be possible for, could you share what any of those tough decisions were?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we've been pretty public about them. The biggest one that I think affects a lot of longtime Firefox users was our decision to move away from sort of what we now call the legacy extension model. Firefox obviously has had a long history of being sort of what it is because of its highly customizable, extensible nature. But, over time, we learned that just sort of giving extensions hooks directly into the internals of your browser without a well-defined API leads to a lot of instability, a lot of slowness, and when people, use the same extension for 6 years, they don't think of that extension as an extension. They think of it as Firefox. And if that extension is giving them a bad experience, then they think Firefox is having a bad experience. And also, it was a massive security hole. An extension could literally do anything. It could RM-RF your hard drive, right? Absolutely anything. It had complete free reign. It had all the powers that Firefox did. And that's sub-ideal. So we took a look around and really, to put it lightly, we took a look around and we saw, sort of the more modern models of, Safari and Chrome, and said, hey, those make a lot of sense, a well-defined API. It's the year, we're in the 2010s. We can have a well-defined API. And we started moving toward that. And we made the decision that if we're going to do this big architectural change, we're going to break a lot of extensions anyway. So that would actually be a really good moment to say, brand new day, please use the new extension model. And I think people feel like that decision was arbitrary, but we couldn't ship all the new stuff and all this new architecture without a lot of confidence that older extensions weren't going to look for something that was moved and crash users' browsers. So that was a tough decision, and people are still, I think, upset about a lot of legacy extensions that are not yet available. But we've been moving really, really quickly to, we reached parity almost immediately with the extension APIs that Chrome has available. In fact, most Chrome extensions are compatible with Firefox. And we're looking to then immediately go beyond and give hooks into stuff that's Firefox specific, give hooks into stuff that maybe other browsers couldn't or wouldn't because of their preferences, and really create some really nice UI around it to help users feel like extensions aren't running rampant on their browser, but are, in fact, something that they've installed and they have some control over. So, and ultimately, there was a lot of hand-wringing and there's still some upset people, but the overall reception of the new model of extensions, which are called web extensions, has been really positive. So, it was definitely a tough decision, but it seems like it's paying off.
My favorite Firefox extension. It's just called Brick My Computer.
I'm sure there was. There was an extension that was called Crash Firefox. It was really cool if you were a developer and you needed to just trigger a crash to test something out. But obviously, that's not something we want random users having.
Something with an actual use case, however, could potentially pose a problem.
Just a small problem.
So, as Firefox has sort of gone this path of Quantum, you're going Quantum on the desktop. Your mobile versions of Firefox are also getting this. I believe that the Android version just shipped with Quantum, I believe.
Just shipped some of the first pieces of Quantum. Quantum is there's sort of four big tentpoles of the four pieces of the browser that we're tackling first. And the first piece, Stylo, is I think has come to Android Nightly, or it just came to Android release. Forgive me if I cannot remember that exactly at the moment, but yeah, we're not leaving Android behind. It's just the stabilization. The stabilization is taking a little bit longer, but we want Firefox for Android to feel just as good as Firefox Desktop, and hopefully maybe even take the engine in Firefox for Android and maybe offer it as a nice web view to other people if they want that same experience.
But yeah, so when you're talking about that being a web view, so would that be something similar to the way that a lot of people when they write Cordova apps use Chromium?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this would be something sort of beyond, what a progressive web app can do, which I see we're going to get to in a little bit, but so we can defer that topic. But sort of, we have this thing called Gecko View, which is just like an Android web view, but powered by Gecko. And obviously, when Quantum comes to the Gecko View, we would love for people to use that and bundle that into their platform, or maybe Firefox, if it's installed on your system, could provide it to other applications. And you could actually say, oh, I have choice in what renderer I'm using to render the web views of all my applications. So you could potentially, like Cordova style, put that underneath. You could, a lot of even, button down shirt and suspenders Android apps ultimately shell out to little web views all the time for different little pieces of UI, and rely pretty heavily on the web platform. So we want to make sure that there's a really, really great rendering engine available for them.
So, obviously, I'd quite like to talk about web components and how this fits into. Mozilla recently announced the intent to implement both Shadow DOM version 1 and Custom Elements version 1. I think that's correct.
Yep.
Kind of, do you have any information on that? Could you tell us a little bit about that, like how soon that might be, or what the plan is there?
Oh goodness, yeah. I'm a long-suffering web components fan. Mostly because I was working with super early web components v0 stuff back in the day for a project called Brick, which I think may have even appeared on an earlier podcast.
We did have an episode of Brick. Yes, we did.
Sure. Which Brick, now defunct, but sadly defunct, was based on Custom Elements v0, and sort of was relying heavily on polyfills and a lot of uncertainty on a shoestring budget. But we'll pour one out for Brick and move back to now. Yeah, we are going to be shipping Custom Elements V1 and Shadow DOM V1. I think after just all the early tumult around web components, we sort of took a wait and see approach, which I think a lot of people did, and said, we're going to wait a moment and just watch to see how these specifications stabilize. And take advantage of all the new nice stuff that's come to the JavaScript language in the meantime, like classes. And I think Custom Elements V1 and Shadow DOM V1 are both vastly improved iterations of those specifications. And I'm really stoked that we're in the process of implementing them. In fact, Custom Elements is available on Nightly right now, but it's prefed off because a lot of people assume that if you have Custom Elements, you have Shadow DOM. And so we break a bunch of websites without having both shipped.
Cool. That's actually really exciting.
Yeah, that's actually something we've seen as just as I've talked about with components on the show is like identifying the different specs. And when you say we've shipped web components, what does that mean?
Totally. I mean, I think everyone gets to pat themselves on the back for having shipped the template tag, I think 8 years ago. So, everyone's like 1/4 of the way through. But Shadow DOM and Custom Elements, I think, really frequently get conflated. And I think there's a good reason for that. But they are really two distinct specifications and two distinct technologies. And you could totally use one without the other. So I'm excited to have both of them just because I think that's the very common expectation, right? It would be like shipping saying we support PWAs and then not supporting, service workers, right? I think there's some things that we've all call conflating together in these meta specs, these meta standards. And, I think that's not a mistake. These things are grouped together because of the desire to see them in the world together. And that creates this developer expectation that if you ship one, you've got to ship them all. That's, I think, okay. But I'm glad that we are sort of taking the approach of, well, we're going to ship them all, but we need to just get them done one at a time.
So I am curious. I mean, with so many specs and the speed of specifications sort of happening in the web sort of communities now, where you see a lot of experimentation, you see specs sort of get worked out not just on paper but in mock code, whether that's in nightly versions or sub branches. I mean, how does Mozilla itself handle that sort of thing? Because there are so many these days, it seems very hard to continuously stay up to date as you try to implement features for end developers to deliver to end users. How are you guys sort of triaging those specs as they come in?
I think we do take not quite I wouldn't say a full wait and see approach, but we do, we're involved in the actual specification discussions. We have folks on all of these standards bodies, in the CSS working group, in the, working groups responsible for the web component specs. So it's not really we're just sitting, around with our arms crossed, but we are like, okay, if we're going to commit our limited engineering resources to this, we've got to see a little bit more traction. That's sort of why my job exists, is to go out, and go to events and talk to people and actually go see of the rain of specs that's coming down, which ones are people excited about, which ones are people saying, I need this, I can use this today to solve a real problem I'm having. And then I can come back and say, I think we should up the priority here. And adjust the priority here, and we should ship these things together if we're going to ship them and things like that. I'm certainly not the product manager, but my team and my colleagues and I actually do have some useful weight within the company of saying, this is what we're seeing in the active web developer community, and help influence sort of the sequencing of some of this stuff. Of course, limited by our engineering resources.
I think it's a very hard thing to do. I mean,
extremely hard.
I look at it seems easy on the outside. A lot of developers say, well, why don't you just implement this thing? And they don't quite understand the sort of engineering challenge that specifications can be when you're talking about such large code bases that have very many moving parts. And yet you guys have made quite a leap into delivering quite a few specs. You guys have delivered web authentication API, which gives you 2FA with basically USB tokens, which I think is great, which that ticket was open for quite a long time.
Just a little bit.
In Bugzilla. But that approach sort of landed, and now that's also landed in Chrome, and everybody else is getting it. And we've started seeing a confluence within the web browser community of browsers really starting to land all these things that have been years really in the making. And kudos to you guys. I think that I think it's a difficult thing that doesn't get a lot of sort of attention. That it's not, oh, I'll just spend a day and it's a weekend, right? It's a weekend for me. I'll just implement the entire spec.
I would say that, people say the browser wars are back. And I think in some sense that's very, very true. There's a super healthy competitive atmosphere right now in the browsing space. And certainly they've never been more sort of critical to how people interact with the internet. Even in the rise of native apps, I think browsers are just incredibly important, more so than ever. And there is this wonderful, healthy competition. Sometimes we used to have a Firefox executive who would say stuff like, this is what we wanted, right? A strong Chrome, Microsoft swinging again, because we wanted the healthy ecosystem. We wanted the healthy competition. But unlike the previous browser wars, where people were sort of just really throwing specs at the wall and seeing what stuck, which created this really uneven web platform, which actually put the web, I think, at a really big disadvantage and let the sort of mobile and native ecosystems kind of subsume them. The current environment, even though it seems super competitive, is super collaborative. Everyone got together and did a handshake agreement that said, CSS prefixes never again. And that was really important. And you see, things like CSS Grid, where, yes, it was a super long discussion, but because of this newfound sort of cooperative spirit, once everything was hammered out, I think almost every browser shipped within like 6 months or 6 or 7 months, but not these huge gap years. And I think developers should expect to see more of that. Maybe not every spec is going to ship in every browser instantaneously, but the collaborative spirit of, okay, we've now evaluated this stuff. We think the specification is sound. And now we're going to ship. And, we're shipping web component specs, and Safari is shipping web component specs. Like, the supposed new IE6 is now shipping, all these PWA pieces. I think we all just need that moment to go from initial excitement back into like implementability. I don't fault the Chrome team for getting developers excited about this stuff and clamoring for it, but there does need to be this period of like actually working out the spec. WebKit gets this reputation for dragging their feet, but if the current battery issues aside, if Apple said to its customers, well, we shipped this new web spec because developers really wanted it, but the battery is going to be 5% slower on the next iPhone because, every time you go into Safari, there's this new crappy spec, people would be dissatisfied. So they work with really real constraints. And everyone, we take a look at all the privacy angles on a lot of this stuff. Like, okay, there's a new timing API. What kind of timing attacks can it do? Especially with Spectre still looming over our heads. Or, hey, there's a new sensor API. What can it learn about you? There's that great, if you've seen the Strava stuff going around, turns out, your map my run GPS trace could reveal the location of a US base. There's a lot of unseen implications with this stuff. And it's really, really great that we've got this 1,000 blossoms of APIs and new specifications, but we do need that moment to breathe and make sure the spec is right. But once the spec is right, you're not going to see much delay in implementation. I'm hoping people are starting to realize that.
I think it's really great to see how closely the browser vendors have been working together on so many of these different specs. I think it's really, really cool. And it's good to think about, needing the time to actually figure out the implications of some of these things and really getting the time to figure out how to implement them properly is so important. Before we move away from web components, though, so on deciding what specs to implement, all those kind of things, there's part of the custom element specification called customized built-in elements, which basically allows developers to extend native DOM elements that already exist on the platform. Firefox has said that correct me if I'm wrong, they're actually going to implement that part of the specification, whereas Safari has said they won't implement it, and Chrome, Blink, haven't implemented that yet. Could you talk a little bit about that, about why Mozilla made the decision to actually implement that part of the spec, which is a bit contentious at the moment?
Goodness. I would speak to that, but I actually do not know the whys off the top of my head about that particular aspect. I suspect for us, it's we took a look at the implementation details behind our controls, and because when you see a native-looking control in Firefox, there's actually a lot of cleverness under the hood to divine what the native look for that control is and propagate it up into the web page. It's not actually the native control, unlike it might be on some other browsers. That's sometimes why our controls don't look fully native, but it does mean that we do have this internal layer where we can map native controls to a platform specific appearance. I think I should not fully speculate here, but I'm going to guess that some of our implementation specifics makes our ability to do that easier. And so I think my guess is that comes from a place of us looking at it and see, oh, well, that doesn't look too difficult. And that's definitely a implementation specific thing. But you're right. If that spec is a real mixed bag of implementers and non-implementers, it may warrant a second pass to understand what's going on there. The hope with a lot of these native controls is that eventually a lot of the built-in or sort of built-in or default control things like inputs and selects and stuff would eventually all be built out of Shadow DOM by the browsers themselves. And so the ability to extend them would be less onerous, but that's not the world we live in today. It's just sort of the exciting future.
Yeah, I mean, I was really happy about that decision because the customized built-in elements piece of the spec, obviously, I don't think anybody thinks it's perfect by any means, but having that ability to properly extend native elements, I think, is really important for developers to, like you said, make the most of those amazing parts of those native elements and actually to be able to do that. So I'm looking forward to trying that out without polyfills for the first time when that finally ships in Firefox, which would be great to hear. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say that 2023 is the year of the customizable select box.
You heard it here first.
I'm putting that in my calendar right now.
Fantastic.
Before, I know we want to start talking about PWAs and some of that stuff. Do you think that now that web components are really starting to make their way into the browsers, do you think this will give rise to more new built-in elements? I'm thinking about the new dialogue element that was added. I think Chrome has, not necessarily the dialogue element specifically, but do you think that after this starts to become more, they start to become more and more used, and we're seeing a lot more use cases now, whether it's like a compiled target for something like Stencil or Angular Elements or something like that. Do you think we'll start seeing more native controls for things that don't require user land implementation?
That's a great question. I would certainly hope so. I don't know what the next native control would be, just because of where we sit right now. But I could tell you that we're actually looking to potentially re-implement the actual user interface of Firefox as web components. So, yeah,
that
just
is one of the coolest things I've heard for a long while.
It's currently built on top of this thing called the Zool binding language, or XBL and Zibble as we call it. It's creaky, and it's we'd really like to stop supporting this sort of weird XML evolutionary fork. That's going to take a lot of work. All of Firefox is written in this, but we have a project called Are We Zibble Still, where we're slowly looking at migrating things and removing all these little bindings. And there's a tool that I, give a little help to that actually will do some transliteral bindings, where it takes an XML file that defines this Zool element that maybe represents the tree view, and it converts it automatically into a new custom element class. And then from there, you have to go in and make sure everything's working and fix all the little use cases. But we'd love to actually wholesale move the UI of Firefox to web components. And so I think once people are comfortable implementing, these sort of quote unquote, native or browser Chrome stuff in web components, it would make a lot of sense that they'd be really comfortable exposing new UI that way as well. I think notably what Chrome's video player is actually Shadow DOM in a custom element. Is that accurate?
I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. No. It is a shadow DOMmed piece.
So I mean, you can see that stuff already appearing. So it's definitely precedent.
No, it's an interesting topic. I mean, I think the nice thing about some of the current specs we have around web components and whatnot is that, again, we can sort of vet the idea before it ever necessarily goes to the standard body. I mean, there's been other ideas over the years for new HTML elements to go sort of into the spec, the next revision of HTML. And with the specs that we have now, we can at least validate some of those claims. I mean, I know for a long time, for instance, the notion of a list, which has become, sort of a list view per se, like that was, a spec that was tossed around for quite a long time, but has refound itself in the mobile era when, oh wow, long lists are hard. Those don't work so well in DOM. So we've come up with implementation around those things, and then at the same time you hear people sort of clamor for VDOM as sort of its own specification within a browser. But is that a good implementation that should be in the browser? Again, it's a hard thing to say, right, until we start to vet some of these assumptions. And now with web components and things like WebAssembly, all of a sudden you can verify a lot of those assumptions yourself.
You sure can.
Which we could not necessarily do without going into sort of the internals of Gecko or Blink or one of those sort of systems to go, you know what, I'm gonna implement this and see how it works. That's a much more accessible thing to a much wider set of developers now.
And I really like that you touched upon sort of that notion of, I think the slang term for it is paving the cow paths, because I feel like we are due for another generation of that. I think people really learned that was a good pattern for browsers in sort of the jQuery era, where the sort of, I like to define the eras of web development as sort of fundamental hacks. And one of the fundamental hacks was, what if we, in JavaScript, implemented a CSS selector engine, right? And everyone was like, we accept that as a valid idea, and then built, this huge ecosystem on top of it. That's, the nature of jQuery. And I feel like we're due for another one of those when you look around at what the fundamental hack of the modern era is, and it's, we implemented the DOM ourselves in JavaScript, and we're going to do that because it's faster and it gives us a lot of nice properties. And maybe it's time for us to look at standardizing what a virtual DOM could be.
jQuery never gets enough credit, as I realize jQuery is not super cool to talk about anymore in the web communities and whatnot, but jQuery did quite a bit for the web community as a whole. I don't think we necessarily have as much advancement as we did had jQuery not sort of been there.
Well, you live long enough to see yourself become the villain, right?
Totally. Yeah, you're spot on.
Well, since we just got to reminisce a bit about the past, Justin, I think we should look a little bit more to the future, and that is with progressive web applications, which I guess there's no reason you couldn't build a PWA with jQuery. Go for it. I would actually love to see an example. But progressive web apps is not a single spec. It is a bunch of different specs. We're starting to see a lot of support. I finally saw Service Worker is going to land or just did land in Safari. So what is the progressive web app story with Firefox? So like what support exists now? What's on the roadmap? Things of that nature.
Sure. We just announced the beginnings of progressive web app support for Firefox for Android and Firefox 58. We're sort of taking an anti-heuristic approach to start, as opposed to trying to gauge user engagement and then prompt a user to install. We are in fact detecting a presence of a web app manifest and badging the URL bar and letting users then say, "Oh, I'd like to, add this to my home screen," and then using all of the rich app manifest and service worker stuff to create the same kind of experience that Chrome would, but sort of with the user on demand. It's really just us trying a different approach. One of the cool things about this standard is, the progressive web apps, how they manifest to the users, not to do a manifest pun there, but as they manifest to the users is all, implementation independent, right? So everyone gets to go innovate in that space. And even though we're all implementing the same specs, how that appears to the user, we're going to try a bunch of stuff and see what people prefer.
I actually like that approach quite a bit. I have not, still haven't tried it out. I've tried a lot of stuff. Haven't played around a lot with Firefox on Android, but I think I do like that approach for making it directly a user decision. I like that.
Well, if I can plug Firefox for Android for 1 second.
Go for
Firefox for Android is great. If you've never played with it, imagine a mobile browser with a rich extension ecosystem. And you can actually install, uBlock Origin on Android. It's pretty nice.
It's very cool.
End pitch.
Well, the funny thing is, because histories, I love a good history story. Firefox on Android for a long time, pre-Chrome, before Chrome and a lot of the browser set was there, when we just had terrible, like whatever variation of web view thing that was on Android. Firefox for Android was just amazing. Like, people seem to forget that really, as far as I was concerned, and I preached this a lot in talks at the time, was Firefox for Android was sort of the place to be. And I find it interesting now that, again, like, it's starting to get features that move beyond most of the other competition within the set. And there is a lot of competition, but a lot of it is, sort of popped Blink. So it is, I like the direction Firefox for Android always has a tendency to take. I dig it.
Yeah. Firefox for Android, is actually, you said pretty early to the Android platform, but it was gone through a ton of iteration, starting off as sort of shipping a full, Firefox platform, controls and all on Android, to saying, hey, how about we build, a Gecko view and then wrap it all in native Android controls, and sort of all these different iterations over time. And it's been fun to watch the Android browser ecosystem kind of grow up around, and all of a sudden see Chrome on Android and see the default browser on Android be really, really capable and called something other than browser. And so we're, it's definitely, hard to not be the default on any platform, but we're pretty comfortable in that position historically. And our goal is to just make something really great there and let people, figure it out and get word of mouth adoption.
If it's any consolation, I did at one point try to port Gecko onto Palm OS for Trio, which was an ill-advised attempt on my part. But I tried. It was harsh, and that did not pan out. But the mobile ecosystem as a whole, that's changing for end users as much as it is for developers now, right? I mean, obviously we're talking about progressive web apps, the technology around them, the notion of offline first. Is Firefox taking those sorts of things? I mean, when you talk about the progressive web app store, obviously you're talking to developers, and developers have sort of their own notion to the table. But when you start to talk to users who are starting to see progressive web apps for the first time, what kind of things are they saying? Do you find that people are starting to understand, like, wow, I can go out there on the web and I can have this experience in Firefox or whatever browser I'm using?
I think the user education and adoption side is still a learning curve, to put it lightly. People have a very set mindset with this stuff. They want to accomplish a task, and they're either going to open the browser and try to do it, or they're going to go immediately search for, thing they want to do app, either just in the search engine, or hopefully they'll at least open the app store on that platform. And it's going to take a little bit of re-education. It's a terrible word. It's going to take it's going to take a little bit of time to people to transition to this idea that, a website can have this capability on this mobile platform, where the paradigm is really fixed. And some of the stuff that's being done to address that is actually really nice. There's this, notion that maybe we can index and list sort of progressive web apps in the app stores. So when someone goes to search for an app to do something, we can say, oh, absolutely, here it is. And maybe they don't even have to care that it's actually launching in a browser. And we can slowly transition people's perception of what a capable application on mobile is by sort of intervening at their current like habitual usage paths and saying, oh, would you like a progressive web app? Oh, would you like a progressive web app? And slowly get them to the idea that maybe they can just search the web and interact with a site that's actually a progressive web app and never have to go through a traditional app store. But it's a long, slow process of these little interventions and little opportunities to, you can't make a user read, but you can hopefully give them a good enough experience that they'll take a different path than they used to.
Is that actually a thing? The ability to, or the thought of adding PWAs to kind of a native app store, is that a thing yet? Or is that just
I would say
idea?
it's definitely more of an idea. I mean, Microsoft, I think, is actually the most forward with that. I think they've sort of formally, and I believe they've at least formally announced the notion that they can go get some web app manifests from the web and put them into the sort of Windows app marketplace. Right. On desktop, which is, I think, really the first toe in the water. We'd love to see that on Android.
Yeah, that'd be good, because we were having a conversation on the last episode about PWA discoverability and things, and of course that would make PWAs a lot more accessible if they're just available natively on the platform's app store. Cool, that's good to know.
It's good to know. I mean, and I, obviously I can't speak for anyone at Android, but I would love to see that feature as well. But hopefully we can also just condition people to search for how to do stuff on the, on their mobile devices the same way they try to accomplish a task on the web. Search for something, and hopefully the top ranked thing offers a really great experience, and hopefully that really great experience, offers you the opportunity to save it to your home screen. People can just get back into that mode.
So how can developers get involved with testing and giving feedback on stuff that's in early stages of development? Is there an equivalent of Chrome's Origin available on Firefox?
So the Origin trials are a really neat idea. I love the idea that any website can sort of turn on a feature in your browser, but only for a really limited trial. I think that's a pretty neat idea, and it requires a lot of infrastructure that we do not presently have, but infrastructure that we are not opposed to building. But presently, no, we do not have equivalent to Origin trials, so we really can't give people the ability to deploy a feature to all of their users, but for a short, a time limited period. But we definitely have sort of the more traditional options out there, which is we put things onto the nightly version of Firefox really early. Things tend to live on Firefox nightly prefed off, sometimes for several releases. And we really rely on people to go check stuff out there, break it, and give us feedback. It's not quite the same as Origin trials. And we've done some thinking about what it would mean for us to do an equivalent program for Origin trials. Google has the advantage of sort of having that sort of application token infrastructure already available. It was something we'd have to build up, and create some sort of portal where folks could register as a developer, prove they own a domain, get an API key, all that stuff. Like I said, we're not opposed to it. If that seems like it's really how things are going, we may do it, but we're looking at alternatives for how we can make a feature available to users of a website as opposed to developers of a website. It's going to be an interesting experiment, I think.
Awesome. That's very cool. I people probably hear, especially if you're on Twitter or anything like that, you see Firefox Nightly thrown around quite a bit when new stuff is starting to land. So speaking of Nightly and like early stuff coming, what are some early stage experimental features that you're most that exist now and you're most excited for people to try?
Oh, sure. I mean, the obvious one for me is, I'd love for people to start, banging on Custom Elements 1 and Shadow DOM 1 when that stuff lands. I know that's not necessarily heavily experimental for people who have sort of been relying on Polymer and the other web components frameworks that have been out there, but it's still super valuable for us to make sure our implementations are rock solid beforehand. And I'm just really excited about it because it'd be nice to toy around with web components again. What else is out there? When we have committed to some of the pieces of the Houdini specification. Those are not presently available in Nightly, but those are sort of on our roadmap. If you're not familiar with Houdini, it's a sort of, once again, an umbrella set of specifications that really gives a lot of customization and control to developers to hook into the CSS style engine in ways that they've never been able to before. I think Chrome just announced early support for the ability to effectively treat the background of an element like a canvas 2D context and draw into it, like stuff that and then control that from within CSS. And that's really, really cool. I know I'm now talking about experimental features that Firefox doesn't have, which is not quite as valuable. But personally, I'm still so excited about web components. That's been my where I've been focused. But I encourage people to keep an eye out on, there's a Firefox Nightly blog and Twitter account where new stuff is popping up all the time.
Perhaps we will see Brick revitalized.
I would very much like that, but I'm going to have to find a different approach to it. That's me and the occasional intern trying to build an entire application, UI toolkit. I think that didn't scale at all.
It's very hard to do, right? Everyone, again, it's one of those things where
right.
No, it's fine. Like I spent a day and I am now the king of UI framework stuff.
And maintainership is a special acquired skill that not everyone has. I have thought about revitalizing several of the Brick components that I really was a fan of. Bringing those back to a custom elements v1 implementation and just releasing them piecemeal, not trying to build an overarching thing. I think people could expect a couple, standalone vanilla custom elements to enter the world in the near future from the remnants of Brick. I'd personally be excited about that. There were some data source things around, like using IndexedDB to back at infinitely scrolling lists and stuff like that I think are still relevant several years on. And I want to make sure that code is unbit rotted for people who might need it.
Yeah, there's so many specs to choose from now. I think it's a very difficult thing for developers who are trying to get work done, but also trying to stay relevant within the set, which is why I like nightlies. Like nightlies are just fun. Like I like have to, people are like, oh, I got to sit there with, I'm like, no, just have some fun. Just write some code that you're going to break some stuff and it'll be all good. Like, no one has to know. It'll be fine. Not everything has to be a blog post, but I'm suppose this day and age it could be.
Actually, just as you're saying that, I just remembered one other thing I'm really excited about, and that is script type equals module. That is now also available in Firefox Nightly, which is the beginnings of actual ES 2015 module support on the web. Which I'm very, very, very excited about. I think the ability to sort of do dependency tree loading on the web is going to save a ton of complexity for people who just really need to build something that's sort of at moderate scale and don't need a colossal build tool chain just to collapse a dependency tree.
Very exciting indeed. And the ability of having modules in the browser just to the whole development process makes things so much nicer because, like you said, you don't have to, wait those few seconds for your build process to go through and, recompile everything and all that kind of stuff. Just being able to go seemingly back in time and just, have things instantly refresh from work without any waiting would be really cool.
I do like the fact that the web seems to be going back to maybe I'm nostalgic, but the web that I used to know, which was I can write code in a browser and it runs. The tool chain, I love a good tool chain. I mean, we use them at work just like, most teams do because, you're shipping things and you have tests and everything else. But, I started out in, just loading things into the browser and typing things. And to some extent, it's one reason I actually really dig web components, was because I can literally go into dev tools of various types in most browsers and just write code, and I can test my theory before I have to, integrate into any tool chaining. I enjoy that immensely.
Totally. I mean, the only reason I'm a web developer today is because I discovered that if I had Notepad and a copy of Internet Explorer, I could goof off in any computer lab in my high school.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Like the ability to write HTML, JavaScript, and just make little toys. I meant that every computer was open to me to program, and I didn't have to have this sophisticated compiler chain. And I'm hoping we can get a little bit closer to that. And that's when I'm really excited for this sort of next wave of standards that are going to take a lot of the great ideas that come from the framework world and the node world and bring those back to sort of the classical browser and script tag environment.
I'm literally giving that talk to a group of 1st through 6th graders this Friday at a school coding club that they have. I'm literally telling that same thing. I'm like, you want to learn to code? Let's open up your web browser. Let's have some fun. I think that instant feedback loop of the web is just so fun. Like you can do little things, and particularly with kids, like they just love seeing that. There's no complication to it. I can just write a little bit of code and magically things work, or it didn't work and I can still change it. I don't need fancy editors or tools.
Yeah,
you see those results instantly. A kid. There's nothing a kid loves more than opening up their school's homepage and making changes to it and sending a screenshot. Like that. It's just instant victories all around.
Little dopamine hits.
Exactly.
All right, so we're starting to run out of time, but we did want to touch on this one last point. So Mozilla feels more like a giant ecosystem than just a company that makes a web browser. Are there other components of Mozilla? So like, are there educational components, community groups, documentation? What are some of these different components and all these moving pieces of this giant mechanism that is Mozilla?
Sure. You're right. Mozilla is a much shaggier, Mozilla has a much shaggier shape than the Firefox company. I think that's certainly our claim to fame, but we do a lot of work both in the technology space and sort of just the internet policy space. Beyond just, the Firefox thing, where really the whole reason we make Firefox is because we want the web to be a healthy and excellent place. And Firefox is our primary expression of how we feel like the web can and should be. So we've got a ton of external things. We do we do campus clubs. We do all kinds of community groups. And we actually encourage people to take these sort of pre-written modules for, building your first extension or, little toys, little activities, and go and get in front of a group of your peers and get them excited about building for the web. We support and officially sort of sponsor the development of the A-Frame library, which is this awesome web components-based library that lets people make their first virtual reality scene effectively just writing what looks like HTML and then slowly peeling back the layers underneath the hood and giving them access to the more powerful and capable WebGL WebGL code underneath. If you ever play with A-Frame, there are tons of great little projects you can get started with. The A-Frame website's aframe.io, and I'll just give that a plug. Mozilla just shows up in all kinds of strange places. We sponsor work on open journalism. We've sponsored work in the open sciences and getting people who are doing fundamental scientific research to have better computer science practices. And hopefully then make the research that much higher quality. And one of the biggest things we're doing right now is a project called MOS, which is the Mozilla Open Source Support. So if you are building a technology for the web that's open source and is really all about some fundamental aspect of the web, you can actually apply for a grant from Mozilla. We've given out, I think, over $1.6 million already in grants to various open source projects to sponsor work, either for specific features or to actually pay for security audits of those projects. So we've taken a look at, various Python libraries, some JavaScript ecosystem things, and actually gone and we've paid for a full security audit of those things because we feel that their security is fundamental to the web. So if you are doing some work, I highly encourage you to search out for the Moss Grant program and apply, maybe get a little bit of money to sponsor your open source project. So hopefully you can have a more sustainable development experience.
That's fascinating.
And real quick, sorry. And then real quick, I just realized also, we host MDN, the venerable web documentation site, which is now actually it's not really the Mozilla Developer Network anymore. It's actually the MDN WebDoc site, because we now have buy-in from other browser vendors, Google and Microsoft, and other people from the W3C who are actually working to make MDN sort of a canonical web documentation platform, which is really, really exciting. That's a pretty new development. There's now a product advisory board made of a ton of web people outside of Mozilla who have stakes in MDN being the highest quality documentation site possible.
And it is. It's such a brilliant resource for developers. I don't think anybody would disagree with that statement.
I do not disagree with that statement. No, it's really good. No, the advisor, there's so many things to talk about in the ecosystem, but we just don't have enough time.
I know. We got to the ecosystem as the last point.
The web, constantly growing. Leon, Danny, are there any other questions that we should ask before we round out this episode of wonderful Firefox goodness?
I think we about covered it.
Yeah, not from me. Just want to say thanks to Matt and for making the web a better place.
I appreciate the opportunity to be on here. This was really fun.
No, thank you so much, Matt, for coming. Is there anything that we did not ask you that we should have probably talked about? I'm sure the list is quite long.
Oh, goodness. The list is super long, but if you're ever curious about any of these other things or have additional questions for me, the best way to find me is on Twitter. I frequently go by Potch, which is Potch, and that is my handle on Twitter, and kind of on most other things. GitHub, you can find me as Potch as well. And I'd love to, hear from folks and answer any other questions. And I hope you go check out Firefox and let us know what you think and what you'd like to see us do, because we're, 2018 is, we just shipped Firefox Quantum and we're ready to do some really incredible stuff. So I hope people not just try our stuff, but tell us about it, because we can't make it better without users and developers' feedback.
You heard the gentleman, ladies and gentlemen. Go out there, give them a feedback, download a release, play with some things, break some things, because it's the web.
Please break them.
And that sounds like a pretty good stopping point here for episode number 152 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've got to talk to Matt about Firefox. Leon did This Week in the Web. And do remember that to sign up for the newsletter on the website so that we can possibly give you a daydream where you can try out A-Frame and some other cool AR, VR stuff in your web browser, because you can use it for that. I've been Justin Ribeiro. This has been Danny Blue and Leon Revel. And we hope to see you next week when we tackle another browser. I believe we have Edge coming on next.
Sure
it's
do.
A week of browsers, ladies and gentlemen.
Ooh.
So this has been episode number 52 of the Web Platform Podcast. Thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your week.